That's a slightly ambitious subject for today. Uh, I think why I really wanted to call in this awareness of this crossroads we are in and have been for quite a while, civilizationally, is because we're all feeling it so intensely on the whole. If you're not feeling in the part of the world, feeling the heat, certainly here actually in the UK, I have some neighbors in France, and it's very hot. Been very hot, very dry, unusually so. And of course, the kind of heat and dryness, and then seeing fires happening around the world, maybe places that we're connected with, have affinities with, out of control, which has become more the norm. To remind us that the messages from nature are unrelenting and accurate as to how we've brought ourselves to this point of the mind, as the Buddha said all that long time ago in the fire sermon. I think that was the third sermon that he offered, that the mind is burning with the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion, and such a mind that's unaware, unawakened, projects inwardly and outwardly. And so we see that mind of the human mind, its projections are being mirrored back from these forces that have of unconsciousness that have brought us to this crisis moment. So I notice that in such moments, there's a sort of bargaining that happens in the mind, like the stages of grief and death and hospicing and so on, or with illness, serious illness. It seems to take a while for humans to move out of denial. I used to contemplate this when we were working and living in the middle of the HIV/AIDS pandemic that severely hit in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And the propensity for that time, nearly 10 years of deep denial from government and many sections of the society. I think there were probably reasons for that. But it made me really think about how hard it is for us to come to terms with very hard truths. And this moment requires us to do that, because until we do, then it's hard for us to move forward proactively. So I think those truths are landing fast and thick now and are very threatening on so many levels to our well-being, to the well-being of our loved ones, to the existence of all of life. Human, we're very focused on the human realm, but the more than human realm is already in a process of mass extinction. We can see that so obviously in the lessening in each spring and summer of bees and insects and the whales washing up on the beach. I was just reading about in California. Just these die-offs of species, as if we weren't a species. So just on this level, which is nature speaking to us, we seem to be slow in hearing the messages. And in response to that, I think there's this psychosis almost that we're in that has catalyzed a series of deep reactions in the psyche, moving from fear and violence that we're seeing in the just thinking of what's happening in just so quickly, these emergence of what is effectively being built across the US, these concentration camps. I think that's what we could call them. People being rounded up and either detention and dying and starving and torture happening without accountability. These data centers. I was just reading a report from the Irish Times, that Irish Independent, that the data centers in Ireland are using 5 million litres of public water a day. So this extraction without public consent, without, without such speed, and this is happening in the sacrifice zones of capitalism. Of this, capitalism is a big word, but it's really just the logic of extraction, with no accountability, no regard as the primary values and motivation, that everything becomes a source to be extracted from. And at the same time, we have reached the point of having our first trillionaire. And it's interesting, I was reading an article by Naomi Klein, who's very well following in this time, that she just released on Substack, where she was talking about, what does this mean, this concentration of wealth and power and influence in all spheres, that the billionaire, on the most part, the new tech oligarchs and other oligarchs have not shy about employing and using and dominating, and making clear what their plans are. And she comes up with a very, I think, interesting, deeper psychological diagnostic about why is there so much investment and fascination and support from those in power for this person, and for, even as an archetype, just to remove it from, we talk about the personality, but for this accumulation of wealth and what's been done with it. And she talks about it's really a simple answer, which is the answer of escape. To escape, she calls it like the version of the billionaire rapture. This idea that when we can't face the problems, we want to escape, and they have the powers to escape the demands of this time, of this frenetic, heating planet that we're on, and the responsibility to each other. We can just live our own life on Mars or wherever. Just this all fantasy. So escaping into fantasy, escaping from the realities of our problems, and we all have ways we do this, and it's not to judge that, but it's very difficult when someone has got so much power and they try and dominate the whole planet or a group of people. So that's what we're seeing, the rise of fascism, of those that don't belong, in the view of those trying to control destiny that we're living within. This also a report that came out. In fact, it wasn't a report, it was a speech by Stephen Miller before 67 countries, who is calling the political so-called left enemies of civilization, comparing them to a disease that must be eliminated. Well, we heard that language before, we know where that goes. And these camps, the Department of Homeland Security have been floating the idea of enabling or getting ICE to enable and capture 10 million people, 100 million deportations, which is basically a third of the US, even though, this is just insanity. So there's this insanity, this violence, this fear, that we are beginning to, the toxicity of this stew within. So what does this mean? Where does this leave us? How can we come to terms with this, and what must we do? Because we're not, the one thing that the Buddha was that he engaged. And he didn't just sit in his meditation seat trying to avoid the problems of the world. He actually interrupted and guided and took on trying to stop wars, trying to stop genocide, actually, even trying to overcome a lack of ethical values in the leaders by imploring them, talking to them, challenging them, and so on. So he also lived in somewhat dangerous times where there was a lot of the old world was disappearing that he was in, the old republics, and new wars were appearing, new struggles for power were happening, and the military conquests and so on. So it wasn't threatening the whole planetary system, but he was also struggling with systems and changing systems. And this often doesn't get highlighted in when we come to understand the transmission of the Dharma. We often think more of meditation, but he was actually quite a dynamic activist that took on systems and evolved them. So he intervened. He didn't go into denial or indifference, and there are many examples of him doing that, and also paying price for it. People tried to take his life. People tried to take him down in the order, take over, but he persisted. So a lot of what we're looking at is really the causes why I wanted to, first of all, I think this is very, very, just on an emotional level, on a psychic level, on a deep unconscious level, this impacts our dreams, the levels of anxiety we feel, the sort of sense of dread that can come upon us as we allow ourselves to really see what's happening around us and happening to people being abused and violated. Seeing a live stream genocide going on for nearly 3 years, seeing this endless, unaccountable levels of horrors, seeing complicity, seeing institutions and judiciary systems being undermined and undone. So there's this feeling of who's in charge, what's happening, where's the accountability, and all of this is leading to a great sense of footlessness and deep anxiety. But there's also within this, I think there's a very profound question that's emerging, something I want to contemplate and have been contemplating, because while we can talk about the systems changing, really underneath that is really what informs the system is the state of consciousness. So we're really looking at ultimately what kind of consciousness will lead at this time, at this crossroads, what will actually inspire, what will actually counterbalance this current logic that we're in of late stage or end stage colonial capitalist empire, and that logic of that we're now, its logic of oppression, of life for a few, for the special few, and everyone else. There's no care, there's no thought, there's no future. So it's very bleak. So we're facing this very bleak situation. It's bringing us to a deep sense of crisis. So one of the things that the logic that we're in is really about separation. Everything is separated from everything else. Everything is isolated, extracted, a desire to control, a fear of the other. And so we can feel that being inflamed in the political discourse, in a lot of the media, is this constant differentiations between people, the pointing out to those that have been historically marginalized, the supremacy of white supremacy, the supremacy of patriarchy, all of these systems, they're all based on this deep separative consciousness. And at the core of that is fear. And the core of that, from fear, when the mind isn't aware, when there's no, or the heart, the citta, and the thinking cognitive mind, where that separative consciousness actually expresses itself through the separation between the sense of me and it and the other out there. When that level of cognitive power is not informed by the jitta, within which the jitta doesn't experience separativeness in the way that the cognitive world frames everything. The jitta actually experiences immediacy. This is awareness itself. This is what we're awakening into. It experiences things more intimately, more felt sense, more intuitively, and more deeply. So there's empathy, there's compassion, there's not the sense of immediate separation, and designating people, groups of people. There's more the felt sense, this is a family, we're in this together, I can relate. But when that citta is flooded and unevolved, so the Buddha was all unevolved, uncontemplated, and it's suffused with fear, then when that fear hits the cognitive mind, then we can become very violent. And this is what we're seeing, is that the roots of that separation are really in this deep sense of alienation and lack of belonging and fear. And so in that violence, we can see how extreme that has become. And that, is being sold as the new normal. We're supposed to accept this, and that those that are resisting it are being criminalized, and all the things that we're seeing happening in the judiciary, in people being arrested and so on the streets if they're protesting. And so it's very, very, it's a very narrow, cold, violent, difficult space and place that demands a loss of humanity, which is what these structures, this late stage that we're in of these systems have basically shaped so much. So it's the complete opposite of what the Dharma, this logic, the logic of empire and the logic of division, logic of separation, the logic of ownership and domination, is the complete opposite of what we chanted early on, the Paticca which is about how we're interrelated, how we belong together, how everything is actually dependent on everything else, how we can't separate out. This isn't just sentimentality. This is actually what the nature and earth is about. We are a part. We are the biggest and the most profound separation that has been embedded in our consciousness and our awareness is from nature itself, of course. Over thousands of years of divorce from our deep embodiment within the natural rhythms of nature. And so this is where it's led us to, and the nature of our own being. So while the empire extracts from that sense of belonging and connection and leaves us isolated, the Dharma does the opposite. It restores our connection. The refuge is not abstract. A refuge is within deep relationship, within the breath, with the earth, with each other, within life, with everything is speaking, like a speaking world and a live world. A life that's the way everything is conscious. It's not unconscious and dead. The world logic of empire sees things materially, soullessly, and dead, whereas the logic of nature, the logic of Dharma, sensitizes us to the aliveness of everything. In fact, it's the opposite, really, is a restoration, and the core medicine is a restoration of relationship. Deep relationship, not relationship from our separativeness, but relationship from being within a web of life, which is a very different move way of understanding ourselves. So in some ways, this is quite radical. This is that seeing life as relationship, and therefore there are certain duties and responsibilities and ways and care about that reality of relationship with each other, with life, with earth, with stones, with trees, with everything that we're interacting with. So perhaps the deeper question at this moment isn't only what are the systems, what are the political structure, but what is the consciousness we're moving from? What is the consciousness that will underwrite where we need to go? And how can we articulate that and create a clearer vision around that to counteract the current vision, which has only the current vision from those holding power, immense power, which actually has no vision for the future of the human realm or the more than human realm. It doesn't have a vision other than the escape for the few. I think that should be clear to us all right now. So what is this is why I feel the Dharma world has something really important to offer here, but we tend to be a bit diffused and not really really reeling, I think, from and not really seeing clearly, and perhaps still bypassing and hoping to sit in our peaceful space somehow. But we can less and less sit in that space because we're very much in a hot seat, and this is only going to increase. So that idea of going back to something that we have to acknowledge it's gone. The world that we were. And it's a deep sense of grief and loss and poignancy. It's a death. And so that's also to give space in the heart for the immensity of what's being lost at this moment. And yet not all is lost. So it's a fine line between feeling that and falling into dread and despair and incapacity and frozenness, which doesn't actually help, although we may feel like that sometimes for sure. So what is it to have a vision? Not really so much, I think the political level is important and to be engaged with, but really what is the vision that shifts from separation to one that's awakening within deeper relationship, which is the ending of the loneliness that we feel. There's something about modernity and empire that's very lonely, and this false persona that it creates, the celebratory and all of those worlds that just very soulless kind of culture. So this reciprocity, regeneration, sufficiency, diversity, mutual flourishing, the upholding of ethics, humane values. There's just so many ways that this consciousness is expressed. And it's not really, these aren't just Buddhist ideas. It's not like creating a new Buddhism. We're actually responding to an ecological reality. We live in an ecosphere that is rooted in compassion. This is an expression of the earth. The earth can also be very fierce. Nature is very fierce, but there is this cohesion and connection that's already here if we choose to tune into that. We're in a sort of cosmology of life, and somehow we've been conditioned to be walled off from that. So what does it mean when we actually feel our connections? So probably while there is resistance to what's happening that we can mobilize around and should be mobilizing around on so many fronts, to this architecture of a culture of destruction, really. What is it to cultivate an architecture of belonging? And so the future is perhaps less decided by who holds the most power, which is what's being decided now, who holds the most power and how they're using that for complete ecocentricity. But what is a vision of reality and humanity? What vision do we want to inhabit that goes beyond the illusion of separation and into the truth of our deep belonging and relationship? So I don't, this is not this. We could say this is political, but perhaps it's helpful to the old politic that we've been in for quite a long time. This uber vulture extraction of capitalism and individuality, and there is no thing as a society, as Margaret Thatcher once said, which has been lived out. What does it mean as this old politic has to die? And, bringing the Dharma, some people like, we're not political, but what about bringing the Dharma into public life? Because what is politics but the public and the commons and the Dharma as commons? What would that look like? Not just another ideology or philosophy, but what could that look like, and how could it speak to us, in our different spheres of life and different spheres in society, and different diversities, different classes, different situations? What is a common ground that a vision could hold that can speak to us? One of interdependence, of generosity, compassion, of care. How do these principles, how are they already showing up? What can we see that's already showing up? How can we amplify that, join that, and so on? So these are some of the thoughts that I'm thinking at the moment to share with you, that I feel ultimately that this extreme pressure and intensity that's being felt in this moment has a power in it, and it's the power of allowing ourselves to let go of what doesn't serve, and to nourish this diamond-like consciousness that's unbounded, that can make leaps of understanding, that can move in quantum-like ways, that can intuit and sense ways through this morass, that can hold a light, that can not be just have hope in a way that isn't really met with something more realistic, but can hold the potential of what this moment holds, not just the destruction of it. But it does mean, I think, that we have to consciously engage and articulate more clearly what is the world that we would want to see, not just to allow that to be defined like Project 2025. They're very good at defining what's wanted in this very narrow fascistic vision, which is full of destruction and oppression. But what is the counter vision? Because if we don't have a counter vision, then it's easy to get dispersed and not really hold a centrality and translate all this into a centrality that is grounded, real, powerful, clear, and unwavering. And inclusive. Yeah, so thank you for being with me. I'm very curious to what you're feeling and thinking in response. You can just take a pause, anything you would like to share, offer, respond to, very welcome. And Sumedh, I think you wanted to say a few things before we open up the space.